Let's go. Side step right left to my beat. Right left to my beat. I like the moon right with me, baby. You know that I got the heat. Let me show you 'cause talk is cheap. Side step right left to my beat. Get it, let it roll. Cool light, cool shade, and you know we don't stop. Highlight, ain't no. You been like, oh my God. We gon' make the rock in his head. We gon' make it bounce in his head.
Hello and good morning everyone. Welcome to this weekly presentation. Today we are going to deliver a speech about critical examination of Form 5 in biology subject. So, are you guys ready? Let's get started. Here is the table of content for this title, which are coverage of the themes, number and arrangement of the topics, learning objective and learning outcomes, scientific key concept, common experiments, possible misconception across the topic, and the last one is the conclusion, and we are doing some discussion on this topic at the end. Before we go through deeper on one by one of our agenda today, it would be good if we first know a little bit information about biology subject in the SKP of KSSM. KSSM Biology aims to develop science literate pupils through learning experience in understanding the biology-related concepts, developing skill using various strategies, and applying the knowledge and skill based on scientific attitudes and values, as well as understanding the impact of science and technological developments in society. These pupils can communicate, make decisions based on scientific evidence, and able to further their education and careers in the STEM field. Biology KSSM enables pupils to achieve the following objectives. First, strengthen interest and passion for biology. Second, reinforce and enrich scientific knowledge, skills, attitude, and values in biology through scientific investigation. Third, enhance the ability to think logically, rationally, critically, and creatively through processes of understanding and applying biology in decision-making and problem-solving. Fourth, acknowledge that the knowledge of biology is temporary and evolving. Fifth, practice the usage of biology language and symbols and equip pupils with skills in delivering physics-related ideas in the relevant context. Sixth, develop mindset about chemical concepts, theories and laws, open-mindedness, objectiveness, and proactiveness. Seventh, realize social, economic, environmental, and technological implications in biology and caring for the environment and society. And the last one is appreciate biology and its application in helping to explain phenomena and solve real-world problems. KSSM Biology focus on thoughtful learning based on the three domains, which are knowledge, skills, and value. The development of this domain will be experienced by pupils through inquiry method in order to nurture thoughtful learning individuals. Biology KSSM Form 4 and Form 5 consists of 5 themes, which are fundamental of biology, physiology, humans and animals, physiology flowering plants, ecosystem and nature sustainability, also inheritance and genetic technology. Each of the themes is divided into several fields of learning.
Hello everyone, my name is Siti Nur Nabilah binti Masromzi. You can call me Nabilah. Alright, now let us move on to our first main content for today, which is the coverage of themes for biology subject for Form 5. As we know, before the SKP of KSSM was first implemented in our current school system in year 2017, before that, we follow the curriculum specification of KBSM. Therefore, here we also show you the differences in the coverage of themes used in biology subject from KBSM and also KSSM. Let us see. For biology form 5 KBSM, it contains only 2 themes, while for KSSM, it contains 3 themes. For KBSM, the first theme is about the physiology of living things and consists of 4 chapters, while the second theme is variation and inheritance, which only contains 2 chapters. Next, for the KSSM, as I mentioned earlier, it has 3 themes, where the first one is physiology of flowering plants, then continue with the ecosystem and the environmental sustainability, and last but not least is the inheritance and genetic technology. Each of the themes has 7, 3 and 3 chapters respectively. So far, did you guys get what I'm trying to convey here? If yes, good job. Are you guys still okay here? Okay, next, let us take a look into a deeper view on the number and arrangement of the topic for biology subject form 5. What we will cover in here is about the number of themes, the scope and sequence of the topics, the balance of breadth and depth, the level of difficulty, the presence of multiple perspectives, and the last one is the ways to make the theme selection better. First of all, we will go to the number of themes first. Aha! You can see here, isn't it more or less the same as before? Yes, that's right. So, without wasting any time, we will look again briefly. For biology, form 5 KBSM, it contains only 2 themes, which are the physiology of living things and variation and inheritance, while for KSSM, it consists 3 themes, which are the first one is physiology of flowering plants, then continue with the ecosystem and environmental sustainability, and last but not least is the inheritance and genetic technology. And let us move to the scope and sequence of the topic. Here, I already sort it into themes and chapter so you can see it more clearly. For the first theme of KBSM, Physiology of Living Things, have 4 chapters, which are transport, locomotion and support, coordination and response, and reproduction and growth. Here, I have highlighted the important content here, where each sequence of each chapter and compare it with biology KSSM syllabus. It can be summarized from here. All chapters from Theme 1 Biology Form 5 KBSM has been brought to Biology Form 4 KSSM. Thus, we conclude that students now they are learning more advanced. Then, we go to the first theme of KSSM, Physiology of Flowering Plant, where it has 7 chapters, which organization of plant tissues and growth, leaf structure and function, nutrition in plants, transport in plants, response in plants, sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and lastly, the adaptation of plants in different habitats. Same as before, it can be summarized. All chapters from Theme 1 Biology Form 5 KSSM has been adapted from KBSM Form 4 and Form 5. However, the sequence are more organized, which in this theme, it only concentrates to the flowering plant only. However, in this theme, there is an additional new chapter, which are Chapter 7, where it is not mentioned in any of the previous syllabus. Now, let us move on to the next theme in KBSM, variation and inheritance. For Theme 2 of KBSM, it only covers 2 chapters, which is inheritance and variation. Same as Theme 1, in Theme 2, all the chapters from KBSM has been brought into KSSM, but in this time in the Form 5 syllabus. Then, for the Theme 2 of KSSM, Ecosystem and the Environmental Sustainability, it covers 3 chapters, which are Biodiversity, Ecosystem, and Environmental Sustainability. For the topic of Biodiversity and Ecosystem, according to the KBSM, these 2 topics has been taught in Biology Form 4. Meanwhile, the second theme also has an additional new chapter which is on environmental sustainability. Finally, we go to the next theme, which are also the last theme. This third theme is only available on the Biology Form 5 KSSM syllabus. But, in fact, the topic of this theme has been discovered on the Themes 2 KBSM. The last theme is Inheritance and Genetic Technology, where the first 2 topics are about inheritance and variations. Like other themes in KSSM as well, this theme also has a new chapter addition, which is Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. Now, we are done with the first and second part. So, let us take a look for the next part, which is balance of breadth and depth. What is breadth and depth? Breadth is learning that covers not just knowledge, but skill and understanding, and refers to the full span of knowledge of a subject. For depth, it is having the opportunity to explore all of the breadth in details, refer to the extent to which specific topics are focused upon, amplified, and explored. First of all, we look forward in the balance of breadth and depth in KBSM. I already divided it into 2 categories, which are the first one is teaching and learning strategies, and the second one is teaching and learning methods. The teaching and learning strategies in the biology curriculum emphasize of thoughtful learning, which use approach inquiry discovery, constructivism, science, technology and society, contextual learning, and mastery learning. Teaching and learning approach can be implemented through various methods such as experiment, discussion, simulation, project, and visits. For KSSM, it also same as KBSM. It is divided into 2 also. Teaching and learning in KSSM also emphasize the thoughtful learning. The learning approach that can be applied by teacher in the classroom are inquiry approach, constructivism, contextual learning, mastery learning, and problem or project-based learning. STEM approach is the teaching and learning methods which applies integrated knowledge, skill, and value of STEM through inquiry, problem solving, or project in the context of daily life, environment, and as well as local and global community. Alright, the next aspect is the level of difficulty. By the way, I want to ask you a question. In your opinion, is learning biology subject is hard and difficult? If yes, why? Basically, based on my research, some of the people says that learning biology is hard because of few factors, just as the use of scientific name, concept, and theories, the complexity or nature of the topics, teacher style of teaching, and students' learning and studying habits. But actually, in my point of view, learning biology are not really hard as we thought. We just need to focus more and put some extra effort in the subject. When we already exactly understand what we are learning, it will be easy. So guys, in learning, please do not give up quickly. We can do it. For present of multiple perspective, what do you understand about multiple perspective? Based on my reading, it refers to the student learning perspective. Although there are many different approaches to learning, there are three basic types of learning theory, which are behaviorist, cognitive constructivist, and social constructivist. This table provides a brief introduction to each type of learning theory. The theories in the table here are treated into four parts: a discussion of the view of the knowledge presupposed by the theory, an account on how the theory treats learning and student motivation, and finally, an overview of some of the instructional methods promoted by the theory is presented. In closing, through its content standard and learning standard, the learning area in each theme describe the range of development, knowledge, skills, and values. Based on the learning area, the content standard has one or more learning standards that together form a concept or idea. Teaching and learning must be holistic and integrated in order to deliver a scientific concept or principle from a few learning standards to the ability of the students. During the intended teaching and learning activities, teachers must examine the content standard, learning standard, and standard performance. Teachers must plan activities that actively encourage students to use their analytical, critical, innovative, and creative thinking skill. The use of technology in activity-based, investigation-based, or experimental-based teaching and learning will promote and strengthen students' understanding. So, that's all from me. Thank you.
Hola! Hi everyone! My name is Nur Aina Athirah binti Juhari. So, today we are going to discuss about learning outcomes and also learning objectives for Biology Form 5. Let's go! At this point, the contents that I will cover are the introduction of the learning objectives and the learning outcomes. I also will show you the stated learning outcomes and learning objectives in Biology Form 5. And lastly, about how to improvise both the learning outcomes and the learning objectives. First, let us recall the meaning of the learning objectives. Learning objectives is a statement of what learner will know, understand, or be able to do as a result of engaging in a learning activities. Next, the importance of learning objectives to teachers. Firstly, it will help teachers to select and organize course contents, and also will help teacher determine assessment creation. The learning objective itself will help and guide teachers to focus assessment aligned with critical learning components of Biology Form 5. Furthermore, it also helps teachers and students to have the overview content in the syllabus. The student should utilize learning objective to guide them as they progress through the course. The excellent learning objectives serve as a guideline for students as they review materials and prepare for assessment. The learning objectives are most effective when they are implementable and measurable. So, these are the four main components that act as a guideline in creating a good learning objective. Objective will include four distinct components: audience, behavior, condition, and degree. The ABCD model is an acronym for audience that refer to who is the learner. To begin a rough draft for learning objective, you may use students will be able to. Yes, this is to help you to get started to make learning objective. Next is Behavior. Behavior is a measurable action word using Bloom's taxonomy. For example, to explain, identify, and so on. Next, condition is the task that must be performed, and lastly, degree, or also known as standard, the task performed like how much, how fast, how many, and so on. Objectives must be both observable and also measurable. To be effective, use of words like understand and learn in writing objectives are generally not acceptable, as they are difficult to measure. Next, we move on to the learning outcomes. What are the learning outcomes? Learning outcomes is the statement that describe the knowledge or skills students should acquire by the end of a particular assignment, class, course, or any program. So basically, the learning outcomes is a statement that provide clarity about the purpose of the course and as a guidance of development in order to facilitate learning and meet training goals. So, the importance of the learning outcomes to teachers is to help teachers to determine methods of assessment. It also allows teachers to set the standards by which the success of the learning will be evaluated. There are two ways or techniques to create complete learning outcomes, which are ABCD and also SMART, or can pronounce as SMART. Actually, these two techniques are basically the same, but what makes it different is the SMART formula is more specific than the ABCD. SMART or SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, reasonable, and timely or time-bound. SMART goals, first one is specific. It is well defined, clear, and state what the learner will be able to do. Measurable is the specific criteria that measure your progress toward the accomplishment of the goal, which can be observed and counted. Action-oriented A is represent behavior change which are attainable and not impossible to achieve. R stand for reasonable, which is can be reached, realistic, and relevant within time. And lastly is T, time-bound, with a clearly defined timeline, including a starting date and a target date. To ensure that an outcome is specific is to make sure that the way it is described is observable or measurable. This means that somebody can see or hear physically, which is physically observed, or otherwise measure the learner achieving the outcome. So, where can we find and get these learning outcomes? Actually, learning outcome should be placed in each of the chapter in the textbook before the lesson start. It means at the front page before the lesson starts. But where? So, let's check whether the learning outcomes and learning objectives have been stated in the textbook Biology Form 5 or not. Can't you see any complete learning outcome here? And can you spot any learning objective? What? Wait. The learning outcomes is known as learning standard in KSSM, and it is provided through a QR code. Steps to scan the QR code is already mentioned at the early pages of the textbook, which are applicable for both Android and also iPhone user. So, here is exactly how the learning outcomes in the first DSKP KSSM look like. First column will be the content standard. It is also known as learning objectives. Next column is learning standard, or known as the learning outcomes. Lastly is the notes column, which mention the suggested activity that can be done through the teaching and learning process. This includes suggestions or activities to be performed or notes related to learning standard and sometimes limitation to the learning standards. That is why teachers need to examine content standard and also learning standard during the teaching and learning activities, so that teachers need to prepare activities which will actively help pupils to exercise their analytical, critical, innovative, and creative thinking. The meaning of content standard is specific statements about what pupils should know and can do during the schooling period, encompassing the knowledge, skills, and values. The meaning of learning standard is a predetermined criteria or indicator of the quality in learning and achievement that can be measured for each content standard. So that is mean learning standard is related to the content standard. Next, we go to the comparison of learning objectives and learning outcomes for curriculum specification KBSM versus DSKP KSSM. This slide shows the curriculum specification KBSM. The first column in curriculum specification already stated as learning objective. From here, we can see that learning objectives already follow the rules or techniques that I had mentioned earlier, that using 4 components of A, B, C, D. The second column is stated is the suggested learning activities for teaching and also learning process. Then lastly, the third column mentioned about the learning outcomes. These learning outcomes in curriculum specification KBSM is known as learning standard in DSKP KSSM. Okay, we move on to the next slide. This slide shows the content standard and learning standard in DSKP KSSM. Can you spot any differences with the previous slide? If you can't remember, I will explain it again. The first column in curriculum specification KBSM already mentioned about learning objectives that follow the rules of 4 components. But in this DSKP KSSM, it's stated as content standard and it does not follow the rules, but it only stated the main content in the chapter that students should learn. So the teachers need to create appropriate learning objectives based on the content standard. Now, we go to the second column. The title of the column is Learning Standards, or known as Learning Outcomes in Curriculum Specification KBSM. The second column in Curriculum Specification KBSM started with suggested activity first. But in the DSKP KSSM, it mentioned the learning standard first, as the last column will be the notes or suggested learning activities. Now, let's take a look more deeper and analyze the learning objectives and learning outcomes in Biology Form 5 KSSM textbook. If you can see the slides, the Team 3 is actually the Team 1 in Biology Form 5 KSSM. Why I wrote it as Team 3? Because it is continuous from Biology Form 4 KSSM. And the chapter 16 in the slide is actually the first chapter in Biology Form 5 KSSM. So I start with chapter 16 until chapter 28 that are continuous from Form 4 Biology, which means that the chapter is actually chapter 1 until chapter 13 in Biology Form 5 KSSM. It might confuse, but the total chapter in Biology Form 5 is only 13 chapters. So here are the learning objectives in chapter 1. One learning objective can consist more than one learning outcomes. If you can see the point 16.2 learning objectives, it consists of more than one learning outcome. Now, we take a look at the example of learning objectives in first chapter subtopic in Form 5 Biology KSSM, which is 16.1. The learning objective is understanding the organization of plant tissues. In this example, there are no audience and no degree, but only consists of behavior and also condition. One way to improvise is by putting the audience, which are students or pupils, and adding the degree, which is growth in plants. Next slide is about the learning outcomes in the same chapter as the previous slide, which is first subtopic in the first chapter. So, these learning outcomes does not consist the time bound. Usually, at the top of learning outcomes in the DSKP KSSM, it should state at the end of the lesson, students or pupils are able to. Then, after that only, can put all the list of the learning outcomes in point state. So that like 16.1.1, pupils are able to communicate. It is action oriented. About the three types of plant tissue and their main function is specific, measurable and reasonable. After end of the lesson is time bound. Okay, we will just go through all the chapters that consist in biology Form 5 KSSM. So, here are all the learning objectives and the learning outcomes in chapter 1, which is under the first theme of physiology of flowering plants. The title for first chapter is the organization of plant tissues and growth. This chapter consists of 3 learning objectives for each subtopic, and the learning outcomes for first subtopic is 1, and the second subtopic consists of 7 learning outcomes, and last subtopic consists of 3 learning outcomes. The learning objectives is the learning objective in the first topic can be improvised appropriately by the teacher. For the chapter 2 titled The Leaf Structure and Function, the learning objectives also can be improvised by the teacher. Compared in the curriculum specification KBSM with the same subtopic, the objective stated is already clear and follow the 4 rules. Chapter 2 have 4 objectives, for which is 1 for each subtopic. Subtopic 1 consists 2 learning outcomes. Second subtopic consists 4 learning outcomes. Third subtopic consists 3 learning outcomes, and lastly 9 learning outcomes for last subtopic. Okay, the third chapter is about the nutrition in plants. This chapter consists 3 learning objectives. The first learning objectives have 2 learning outcomes. The second consists of 2 learning outcomes, and last learning objective or subtopic consists of only one learning outcome. Next, chapter 4 is about the transport in plants. The transport in plants also in curriculum specification KBSM Form 5 chapter 1 in subtopic 1.7 and 1.8. The learning objectives and the learning outcomes in the DSKP KSSM more details and compact compared to KBSM. In chapter 4 KSSM, it consists of 4 subtopics and 4 learning objectives. The first learning objectives consists of 3 learning outcomes. Second subtopic or learning objective consists of 4 learning outcomes. Third subtopic consists of 3 learning outcomes, and last subtopic consists of 3 learning outcomes. For chapter 5, the responses in plants have 3 subtopics and 3 learning objectives. The first learning objectives consists of 1 learning outcomes, and second learning objectives consists of 4 learning outcomes, and last learning objectives have 2 learning outcomes. Now just take a look again at the learning outcomes for the third learning objectives in chapter 5. This lesson outcome does not have time bound, which should be inserted together with the sentence at the end of the lesson. Student should be able to. Chapter 6 is about sexual reproduction in flowering plants. This chapter consists of 5 subtopics, which means it consists 5 learning objectives. The first subtopic consists 2 learning outcomes. Next, it consists of 2 learning outcomes. Third learning objective consists of 4 learning outcomes. Fourth consists of 3 learning outcomes, and last subtopic only consists of 1 learning outcomes. Chapter 7, which is the adaptation of plants in different habitats, only consists of 1 subtopic. And if 1 subtopic, it means that 1 learning objectives. So the learning outcomes in this chapter is only 2. This is the new chapter in biology. Chapter 8 is the first chapter in the second theme in biology Form 5 KSSM. It consists of 3 subtopics, which means 3 learning objectives. The first learning objectives have 5 learning outcomes. The second subtopic consists of 3 learning outcomes, and the last subtopic consists of 5 learning outcomes. You can read the explanation in the pink chat box to understand why that learning outcomes is hard to determine. Both chapter 8 and 9 is from chapter 8 Form 4 Biology KBSM. Next, chapter 9, which is ecosystem. Chapter 9 have 2 subtopics. The last chapter for this theme, which is the environmental sustainability. This chapter is a new chapter in biology Form 5. This chapter consists of 4 subtopics, which means it has 4 learning objectives. So the first subtopic consists of 3 learning outcomes. Second subtopic consists of 2 learning outcomes. And last subtopic consists of 3 learning outcomes. So let's take a look to the learning objective in subtopic 4 in this chapter. For your information, you can read the explanation at the pink chat box. The last theme in biology Form 5 KSSM is inheritance and genetic technology. The first chapter in this theme, which is chapter 11, inheritance, consists of 4 subtopics. Inheritance also consists in chapter 5 KBSM for Form 5. This chapter comprises into 4 subtopics, which means 4 learning objectives. The first subtopic consists of 6 learning outcomes. The second subtopic consists of 5 learning outcomes. The third subtopic consists of 2 learning outcomes, and last subtopic consists of 6 learning outcomes. For chapter 12, which is variation, consists of 3 subtopics. There are 1 learning objective for each subtopic. The first subtopic consists of 6 learning outcomes. The second subtopic consists of 2 learning outcomes, and the last subtopic consists of 4 learning outcomes. Finally, the last chapter in biology Form 5 KSSM is the new chapter, which is genetic engineering and biotechnology. This chapter consists 2 subtopics. Each subtopic consists of 1 learning objectives. For subtopic 1, there are 2 learning outcomes, while subtopic 2 consists of 3 learning outcomes. Lastly, these are some ways on how to improve both learning objectives and also learning outcomes. Now, I will pass to the next presenter.
Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. As stated before, it is me, Zakuan Aiman bin Radziyuddin. I am going to share with you about my part in critical examination, which is the scientific key concept. First of all, scientific key concept is a scientific ideas and understanding that we hope will remain to our student even after they left school. So there you have it, a simple definition of scientific key concept. So let's proceed to the next slide. Okay, as you all know, our Form 5 Biology textbook consists of 3 themes that have 13 chapters. The first theme is Physiology of Flowering Plant, which aim to give basic understanding of plant physiological processes. This include tissue organization, growth, nutrition, reproduction of plant, their adaptation, and also the habitats of plants. For the first chapter, which is the organization of plant tissue and growth, I want to ask you, we as a biology student, what kind of key concept that we expect for our student to understand? So let's dig it up. The first key concept is epidermal. It is the outermost surface on the stem and roots of young plant. It contains cuticle that prevent water loss during evaporation. The second tissue is ground tissue, and it is divided into 3 classes, which is the parenchyma tissue, collenchyma tissue, and sclerenchyma tissue that provides support and turgidity in plant. The final tissue is vascular tissue. It is consists of xylem and phloem. It is a common tissue among biology students. Okay, the function of xylem is to transport water and mineral to all part of plant. For phloem, it helps to transport food that has been produced through photosynthesis process to all part of plant. As you can see, this chapter, which is chapter 1, helps students to know the classes and the subclasses of tissue that needed to keep in mind because it will be used for further chapters. Now we reach the second chapter, which is the leaf structure and function. So let's see what kind of key concept they need to know. The first key concept is light spectrum. It consists of 7 colors that have different wavelength. At this point, student will acknowledge what kind of colors that crucially needed to increase the rate of photosynthesis, which are the red and the blue lights. Next, compensation point. It occurs when the rate of photosynthesis is the same as the rate of respiration. This helps students to make conclusion between the light intensity and the amount of glucose remain in the plant. By referring to the Bloom taxonomy, this is the point where the student be able to apply what have they learned and understand between photosynthesis and respiration. Now we have reached chapter number 3, which is nutrition in plant. In this chapter, the key concept helps students to differentiate each type of nutrients and their function in plants. The first key concept is micronutrient. It explains the most or primary nutrients that needed to maintain plant growth and quality of the crops. Students will also learn about the function of each nutrient like hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. After that, we have micronutrient, which means the nutrient like manganese, chlorine, and iron are needed in small portion. In conclusion, for this chapter, I found out this chapter needs lots of reading and memorizing process in order to classify the nutrient and their function. Now we have entered chapter 4. I try to make it simple as possible. I hope you can give your full attention throughout my session. Now let's go. Okay, in chapter 4, we will learn about transporting plant from the Bloom taxonomy. This is the part where students will apply what they have learned in previous chapter, which is on diffusion, because it will be applied here in chapter 4. First of all, we have a process called translocation. It is the process where plant transport essential material to all parts of the plant, just like photosynthesis processes. This is what I mentioned before. There are several subtopics involved in order to understand and to be applied in chapter 4. Let's move on to the next slide. The next process is glutation. It is a process where a droplet of water can be seen at the tip of the leaf without the aid of stomata. Have you ever experienced this kind of phenomenon before? It usually occurs in the morning. Have a look then. Okay, just like I said before, the term stomata, it will be mentioned again in the next chapter that covers on the adaptation of plant to their surrounding. So that is the end of chapter 4. Now we will have a look on chapter 5 that touch on the response in plant. There are several experiments that can be done outside of the lab, which we will find several species of plant that have different responses mechanism to ensure their survival in their current habitats. In Bloom taxonomy, this experiment helps students to apply and analyze type of plant that have different responses toward external stimulus. Firstly, we have tropism, which explains on response created by roots and shoots, whether towards or away from the stimulus. For example, thigmotropism, geotropism, phototropism, and chemotropism. This is the part where students need to test their ability to remember of each type of tropism. After that, we have nastic. It is a type of movement that are non-directional towards stimulus. For example, photonasty, semonasty, thermonasty, and thigmonasty. Based on the picture shown above me, it is a mimosa plant species, or in Bahasa Melayu we call it as pokok semalu, that respond toward any vibration. So that is the end of chapter 5. Now let's move on to chapter 6. Sexual reproduction in flowering plant. This chapter wants students to know the organ and type of reproduction involved in plant. So let's have a look. The first part is pollination. This will give ideas to students on the basic on how sexual reproduction occur in plant, which is the pollen grain will be transferred to stigma. Let us see a picture in the next slide. As you can see right now, there is a bee that moves from one flower to the other flower. The pollen is attached to the bee and later on will be transferred to the stigma. This shows us that pollen grain can be transferred by different pollinator agents like wind, insect, water, and animals. So the next slide is fertilization. Fertilization is a process that occurs after pollination. Students can understand the process of fertilization in plant by knowing the organ involved in the flower. For more information, let's have a look on another example. In the diagram, we can see how sperm fuse with the egg inside an ovule. After fertilization occurs, ovule will develop into a seed. In my opinion, the process can be quite complicated if it is not taught by using different analogy to make the student understand by the teacher. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Now my friend, we have reached the final part of the first theme, which is chapter 7, adaptation of plant in different habitats. From my opinion, this is the part I wish students can gain their full attention to learn and understand, because this is the best part of learning about plant. This is because we can see some uniqueness of adaptation from the plant towards their surrounding. So let's go. First of all, let us know the definition of adaptation. It is an adjustment made by the plant toward the environment, whether it is cold, hot, watery, and dry. For example, halophytes, hydrophytes, mesophytes, and xerophytes. Students can analyze different adaptation occupied by the plant by looking at the plant characteristics, the environment, and their adaptation mechanism. So there you have it, chapter 7. Now let's proceed to the next theme. Our second theme is ecosystem and environmental sustainability. From my opinion, this is my favorite theme in Form 5 biology textbook because it will encourage students to evaluate, just like in the Bloom taxonomy process. Let us find out what does evaluate means. The first chapter in the second theme is chapter number 8, which will explain about biodiversity. Biodiversity is a variation of living organisms from all sources, including the terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic habitats. So, students will be introduced various habitats and what kind of species that live there. Also, the way they interact with each other. After that, we have taxonomy. It will help students to name, describe, and classify each species they learn in the textbook. Okay, I think that is enough on the introduction of this theme. Let's move on to the next chapter. In chapter 9, we will learn about ecosystem. So basically, ecosystem is a combination of few communities that live and interact with each other, whether it is between living things and non-living things. Just now, I have mentioned about living things and non-living things, right? So, let me explain it in detail. The first one, biotic factor, refers to the living component that interact with other organisms like producer, consumer, and decomposer, while a biotic factor is non-living element like pH, temperature, light intensity, and air humidity. So, at the end of this chapter, students will know how they will interact with each other to create an ecosystem. In chapter 10, we will learn about environmental sustainability. First of all, let us learn about eutrophication. It happens when plant and algae grow excessively due to increase in limiting growth nutrients. Have you ever seen this before? It usually occurs near a land that humans grow their crops. After that, we have green technology, which is an application of science and technology to produce ecologically beneficial products. In conclusion, it helps students to know what kind of activity that can harm the ecosystem and how to manage the damage did by the human or the natural phenomenon itself. Now, we have entered the third themes of this textbook, inheritance and genetic technology. Basically, we will learn about human genetics and current technology to improve medication. So, let's have a look. In chapter 11, we will learn about inheritance. This is the part where students sometimes got confused because there are some terms that are not very clear. For example, gene and DNA. Both are totally different in their definition. Gene is a physical and functional unit of heredity, while DNA is the material that makes up genes. So let's move on to the next slide. After that, we have dominant, which is the two version of genes that refer as dominant. So this is the part where student can determine the dominancy of the offspring. We now enter chapter 12. We will learn about variation in human and animals. So let's go! Firstly, we will learn about variation, which is refer to the difference in DNA sequences found in each our genomes. It can be distinguished by skin tone, hair colors, and even the form of our face. After that, we have mutation. It is a sequence of DNA changes. It can occur due to errors in copying DNA sequence. Sometimes it can happen from direct exposure from the radiation and chemicals. Finally, we have reached the final part of this textbook, genetic technology. Okay, the most important key concept in this chapter is genetic engineering. It is a process where manipulation, alteration, and recombination of DNA and acid molecule in the purpose of altering an organism or population of organism. So, students will know the benefits of technology and science on human life nowadays, especially in the aspect of medication. To wrap this up, for my conclusion, key concept in the textbook is the most important tools to improve understanding throughout the whole chapter. But I found out some of the key concepts in the textbook are not well explained in a detailed form compared to what I have learned before. It can be improved by explaining in a simple form without leaving the important terms from each definition of the key concept. So that is all for me. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Now I will continue our presentation with the next scope, which is common experiment. So, what is an experiment? According to Helmenstein 2020, an experiment is a procedure designed to test a hypothesis as part of the scientific method. Although some experiments take place in laboratories, we could perform an experiment anywhere at any time. we have three types of experiment, which is the first one is a natural experiment. A natural experiment also is called a quasi-experiment. A natural experiment involves making a prediction or forming a hypothesis and then gathering data by observing a system. The variables are not controlled in a natural experiment. The next type of experiment is controlled experiment. Lab experiments are controlled experiment. In a controlled experiment, you compare an experimental group with a control group. Ideally, these two groups are identical except for one variable, the independence variable. For the field experiment, it can be either a natural experiment or a controlled experiment. It takes place in a real-world setting rather than under lab condition. Scientific investigation is commonly used in science lesson. The hypothesis is tested by students through an investigation to discover certain scientific concept of principle. Carrying out scientific investigation or experiment encourage students to cultivate thinking skill, science process skill, and manipulative skills. These are general steps of scientific investigation based on the SKP, which is the first one is to identify problem that can be tested using scientific investigation. Next, making a hypothesis. Plan how variables are manipulated and data are collected. As we know, we have three types of variable, which are independent variable, dependent variable, and control variable. Next is plan and carry out the scientific investigation. Present the data, interpret data and result with scientific reasoning, and the last step is making decision and presenting the report. Before we go further, I would like to share about a new format for Paper 3 SPM that will be started this year, 2021. As you can see from the table, for the KBSM, we use a written test. However, it changed to a practical test for KSSM. We have 2 questions for KBSM, but for the KSSM, we have 3 items which depend on the subject the students registered. 3 items means it have 3 questions from different subjects. For example, question 1 for chemistry, question 2 for physics, and question 3 for biology. Each item will give 15 marks. The time given for each item is 45 minutes. In 45 minutes, the students need to conduct the experiment and answer the question. The total time spent by students in the lab is 2 hours 15 minutes. In the KSSM textbook, there are 7 types of activities. We have simulation, inquiry-based activity, visit, STEM, 21st century learning, experiment, and green technology activity. This is an example of simulation activity where students need to imitate the real situation by designing stomata opening and closing. The right image shows example of an inquiry approach activity where students emphasize learning through experience and discover the cross-section of monocot and eudicot leaf. This is an example of a visit activity to a botanical garden that can make learning more effective and fun. The right image shows a STEM activity to design an environmental friendly track. This STEM activity approach integrate knowledge, skills, and values of STEM through inquiry and problem solving. This is an example of 21st century activity by using a mind map to explain double fertilization, and an example of an experiment. This is the last example of activity in the KSSM textbook, which is green technology activity. As we know, green technology refers to the development and application of product, equipment, and system to preserve the environment. This is the special part of the KSSM textbook, where it using technology in learning, which is augmented reality. Augmented reality is an enhanced version of the real physical world that is achieved through the use of digital visual elements, sounds, or other sensory stimuli delivered via technology. In other words, augmented reality can produce a 3D image through technology such as phone. This is an example of a 3D image produced from the textbook on page 29. It is about internal structure of a leaf. This is also an example of augmented reality in the textbook. Implement technology such as augmented reality is very important because it can improve students' motivation in science learning, and at the same time the learning process will be more exciting and effective. This is the list of the experiments that contained in the KSSM textbook. As you can see from the slide, for chapter 1 we have 2 experiments, for chapter 2 we have 4 experiments, and for chapter 3 only 1 experiment. For chapter 4 there are 5 experiments. For chapter 5 it has 2 experiments and no experiment for chapter 6. For the chapter 7 and 8, also there is no experiment. In both chapter 9 and 10, there are only 1 experiment. No experiment for the chapter 11 and 13, but it has only 1 experiment for chapter 12. Even in the textbooks, there is a lot of experiment. However, based on the SKP, KSSM, there is 10 compulsory experiment that is conducted using an inquiry approach, and not all chapters include. Chapter 1 is Organization of Plant Tissues and Growth. Activity 1.1 is one of the compulsory experiments. Even it is not labeled as an experiment, but it is an inquiry-based experiment where the students need to identify zone of cell division, zone of cell elongation, and zone of cell differentiation in acid radical by using a light microscope. At the same time, this experiment will teach students how to use the light microscope in the right way. Moving on to experiment 1.1, which the students need to conduct an experiment to study the growth curve of a plant. In this experiment, the students need to observe the corn seed for 21 days to get the result. Now, we move to chapter 2, Leaf Structure and Function. In this chapter, there is 3 compulsory experiments, which is first is experiment 2.1. This experiment will be conducted to compare stomatal distribution on the upper and lower epidermis of monocotyledon and eudicotyledon leaf. In this experiment, the students can identify which epidermis has more stomata and can do a comparison between 2 types of leaf. Moving on to the 2.2 experiment, where this experiment is to study the effect of environmental factors such as air movement, light intensity, temperature, and relative air humidity on the rate of transpiration using a photometer. Photometer is a device used to measure water intake by a leafy twig. While the 2.3 experiment is to study the effect of environmental factors such as light intensity, temperature, and carbon dioxide concentration on the rate of photosynthesis. Next, we move to the chapter that has a compulsory experiment, which is chapter 4, Transport Implant. Experiment 4.4 is to study the effectiveness of phytoremediation plants, which is water hyacinth, in controlling water pollution, where this plant can absorb heavy metal in water. Experiment 4.5 also to study the effectiveness of phytoremediation plant, which is water spinach, but in controlling soil pollution, where the water spinach also can absorb heavy metal from soil. Now, we move to the next compulsory experiment from chapter 5. Experiment 5.2 is to compare the effect of the presence of a phytohormone, which is ethylene, on fruit ripening. The hypothesis states that the fruit with ethylene ripen faster. So, the student will identify either the hypothesis was accepted or not after the experiment. The next compulsory experiment is from chapter 10, which is environmental sustainability. Experiment 10.1 is to compare the level of biochemical oxygen demand (BOD) present in the various samples such as in tap water, drain water, river water, pond water, well water, and distilled water. The last compulsory experiment is from chapter 12, which is variation. Experiment 12.1 is to study continuous and discontinuous variation in human, which is height, body weight, and fingerprint. So, in my opinion, even the compulsory experiment that mentioned in the SKP need to conduct in school, however, have a few limitations faced by teachers and students to conduct the experiment. The problems that always happen in school laboratory are lack of equipment, inadequate materials, students not taking the experiments and laboratory activities seriously, students coming to the lab without getting prepared, and the experiment itself take a long time to obtain results, such as experiment 1.1, where the students need to observe the growth of corn seed for 21 days. Yes, even there are limitations, but we cannot deny the benefits of science lab experiments. Science lab experiments can promote the development of scientific thinking in students. In school science labs, students are viewed as active learners and not just passive recipients of knowledge. Science experiments play a very crucial role in the ongoing intellectual development of students. In science laboratories, students get time, space, as well as resources to exercise their curiosity. Rather than making the students memorize the facts, they need to improve their laboratory skill, especially the new format for Paper 3 SPM changed to the practical test. To have excellent laboratory skill, the teachers need to figure out the best method that can improve the lab skill among students, especially during online learning. The use of technology also can be effective assistance in science teaching and learning. That's all from my part. Let's move to the next presenter.
Hi, I am Zainey Azneyra binti Zainudin. Today I will present on possible misconceptions across the topic. I hope you guys are still awake. When teachers provide instruction and concepts in various subjects, they are actually teaching students who already have some pre-instructional knowledge about the topic. Students' knowledge, however, can be illogical or misinformed. So these illogical understandings are termed as alternative conceptions or misconceptions. Alternative conceptions or misconceptions are not unusual. In fact, they are a normal part of the learning process. We quite naturally form ideas from our everyday experience, but obviously not all the ideas we develop are correct with respect to the most current evidence and scholarships in a given discipline. Moreover, some concepts in the different content area are simply very difficult to grasp. They may be very abstract or quite complex. Hence, our understanding of them is flawed. In this way, even adults, including teachers, can sometimes have misconceptions of material. So, what is misconception? Misconception is a view or opinion that is incorrect because based on faulty thinking or understanding. There are 5 types of misconceptions that can be categorized. So, let's go one by one. The first is preconceived notion. It is the most popular conceptions in our everyday routine. The second one is non-scientific belief. Non-scientific belief include views learned by students from sources other than scientific education, such as religious or mythical teachings. The third is conceptual misunderstanding. It arises when students are taught scientific information in a way that does not provoke them to confront paradoxes and conflicts resulting from their own preconceived notion and non-scientific belief. So to deal with their confusion, students usually will construct faulty models that usually are so weak that the students themselves are insecure about the concepts. Next is vernacular misconceptions. It arises from the use of words that mean one thing in everyday life and another in a scientific context. And the last one is factual misconceptions. It is faulty, often learned at an early age and retained unchallenged into adulthood. Okay, without hesitation, let's go through chapter 1. Organization of plant tissues and growth. Perennial is often used to describe plants that live more than 2 years and usually flower every year. And yet, most non-flowering plants are also perennial. So, over generalizations, perennials are often said to sexually reproduce every year, but many perennials do not.
Some sexually reproduce only once, such as bamboo. Some may not sexually reproduce at all if they are just reproduced asexually. So students are always misinformed about this plant. For chapter 2 is leaf structure and function. In this chapter we will discuss about photosynthesis versus respiration. This topic is, I think it is popular among students. So let's see. Students may think that plants breathe by inhaling carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen. The truth is, plants take in air through their leaf. Both carbon dioxide and oxygen are used for different processes. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide while respiration requires oxygen. While plants do release oxygen, it is a byproduct of photosynthesis and is not released through breathing. Plants do not breathe, they absorb through stomata in the leaf. Even me myself, when I was young, I thought that plants breathe just like us. For chapter 3, we will discuss the topic about nutrition in plants. For this topic, what do you think? Do you think that plants eat just like us? Do you think that plants have mouth? Okay, let's be frank. Even when I was young, I thought that plant is a monster. They have mouth to eat. They will use their mouth to eat at night when people not see them. It is such weird misconceptions. I mean, I may be influenced by movies, you know. I think that's normal for kids. We tend to believe that food must come from outside of an organism, while outside sources of food are true for animals, but not for plants. Plants produce sugars and starches through the process of photosynthesis. Have you ever heard about fertilizer? Fertilizer, commonly known as plant food. They may add to the confusions. Students may think that plants need plant food to eat. Instead of thinking, plant food or fertilizer can provide additional minerals and nutrients for the plants. Even me, I think that every plant needs fertilizer. While plants do require these substances for growth, they can fulfill these needs through minerals in the soil and through photosynthesis. Let's move to chapter 4, transport in plants. When you are young, have you ever wondered how plants take in water? Is it from their leaves or roots? Students might think that leaves take in water, but the truth is water is taken through the roots. Chloroplasts in the plant absorb the sun's energy to use it in photosynthesis. Water and minerals are taken through the roots. This is often misleading among students. Chapter 5 is response in plants. Have you heard about tropism? Did you know that the word tropism actually comes from the Greek words tropos, which means a turning? What is actually tropism, and what misconceptions regarding tropism? Let's see. Tropism may easily be the most misdefined term in plant biology. Defining tropism as a growth response to an environmental factor is far too vague. Tropism refers to the direction of plant growth being determined by the direction of an environmental factor such as light, gravity, or touch. For chapter 6, sexual production in flowering plants, we will discuss about monoecious species. Did you know what is monoecious species? Monoecious species are often defined as having staminate and carpellate flowers on the same plant. These exclude monoecious gymnosperms that have pollen cones and seed cones on the same plant. A plant cone is not always produced from a single cell, although it can be. plant cones are usually grown into from shoots, roots, or leaves. Chapter 7, Adaptations of plants in different habitats. In this chapter, we will touch about adaptation of halophytes. What is halophytes? I bet you already forgot it. Let's see. Although there are not an enormous number of halophytes, they are distributed across lots of plant families. It is believed that the adaptations needed to survive these inhospitable habitats have evolved independently on many occasions. The fact that so many species have ended up with similar coping mechanisms is yet another example of convergent evolution. Next, adaptations of halophytes is being a succulent. Lots of halophytes are succulent. This means that their stems and leaves are very fleshy and watery. Succulent plants have fewer cells, and these cells are longer than those in other plants. Next adaptation is small leaves. Halophytes' leaves are excellent at counteracting the desiccating effect of salt. Many halophytes plants have tiny leaves. These have a small surface area, so less water is lost through transpiration. Lots of species have few and small stomata. Again, this will help the plant to cling onto water. Did you know that halophytes secrete salt and salt gland? Salt levels can be regulated using salt gland. These excrete salt either direct onto the leaf surface or into a discrete gland. These can be vacuoles of bladder cells and are often hidden just below the surface of the epidermis. In some species, these glands burst. In others, they break off and fall from the plant, carrying their toxic salt burden with them. These salt bladders accommodate the build-up of salts or other ions and allow a plant to exclude certain elements from its tissues. Chapter 8 is about biodiversity. This topic is, for me, it is interesting and quite popular. For this topic, we will discuss about bacteria and viruses. I think most of the students confused about bacteria and viruses. Are they the same? If they are different, what makes they different to each other? Actually, bacteria are not virus. A bacterium differs from a virus in its structure and in the way it inhabits a host. Whereas, most bacteria live as independent cells with a membrane to separate them from the outside world. Viruses can only multiply inside and to the detriment of the cells they infect. Interestingly, some viruses called bacteriophages have specialized to infect bacteria. Virus consist only of genetic material, or we call it DNA or RNA, surrounded by a protein shell. They cannot metabolize, and once inside a host cell, their genetic materials will hijack the cell's machinery to produce replicas of the virus. Both virus and bacteria can cause disease. However, not all types of virus cause disease in humans, and not all bacteria cause disease. Let's move to chapter 9, ecosystem. In this chapter, we will talk about food chain and food web. I think since we are in primary schools, we already heard about food chains and food web, is it? But this misconceptions. We even carry it to our adulthood. Students might think that organisms higher in a food web eats everything that is lower in the food web. But actually, organisms higher in a food chain eat some, but not necessarily all of the organisms below them in the food web. And do you know why there are more herbivores than carnivores? In a food chain, energy is passed from one link to another. When a herbivore eats, only a fraction of the energy becomes new body mass. The rest of the energy is lost as waste or used up by the herbivore as it moves. Likewise, when a carnivore eats another animal, only a portion of the energy from the animal food is stored in its tissues. In the other words, organisms along a food chain pass on much less energy in the body form of body mass than they receive. Chapter 10, Environmental Sustainability. Please bear with me for 3 more topics to finish. So for chapter 10, it is about environment. For this chapter, we'll touch about pollution. So most of us always think that the air quality is always better indoor than outdoors. We always think that when we are outside the house, we are exposed to air pollution. We didn't realize that sometimes the air indoor is also not safe for us. It is also polluted. Indoor air quality generally seems better than the quality of the air outside, where visible clouds of dark smoke are seen. But the truth is, the indoor air quality is not always like we think. There are a few types of indoor air pollution, which are biological pollutants, combustion pollutants, chemical pollutants, and particle pollution. Chapter 11 about inheritance. When you are young, when you are in secondary schools, how did you differentiate between the genetic terms? Because genetic terms are always confusing and it is always hard to differentiate. Genetic terms are often confusing. Many students understand the basic ideas of genetics, but we need more familiarity with the terms. For example, students often struggle with the difference between a chromosomes, a gene, and an allele. Chromosomes are organized structures containing proteins and a single coiled strand of DNA. Chromosomes are visible with a microscope only during parts of the cell cycle. Genes are units of heredity, specific sequences of DNA or RNA that create proteins with particular functions in an organism. But what about alleles? Alleles are variants of a gene. Making sure that students have a strong foundation in the terminology can greatly improve their understanding of genetics and also will prevent misconception. Hang on, there are 2 more topics to finish. Chapter 12, this is the second last topic. Chapter 12 is about variation. So for this topic, I will talk about mutation. When we heard about mutation, we think that all mutations are harmful. Am I right? Or am I the only one who thinks that way? A mutation is a change in the genetic code of an organism. Many mutations are harmful and cause the organisms not to develop properly. However, many mutations are silent and some prove beneficial. In the case of a silent mutation, the change in the genome does not change the production of the amino acid sequence and subsequent protein. Remember that multiple codons may code for the same amino acid, so a change in one nucleotide does not necessarily change the gene product. So if an organism does live with a mutation, then often the environment will determine whether the mutation is beneficial or harmful. Production of one protein versus another may confer a characteristic such as a difference in coloration in the ability to digest a resource. Example, the ability to digest lactose or maltose instead of sucrose. The phenotypic outcome may be selected for or against depending on the environmental factors. Finally, it's the last chapter for today about genetic technology, chapter 30. So, in this topic, I will touch about GMO food. I think GMO food is not something unusual to us. We already get used to GMO food, is it? Some people love to take GMO food, but there is one statement that is confusing. The statement is, consuming GMO foods can change your DNA. Is it true? No, it is not true. Every food you eat that contains protein contains DNA, whether it is a GMO or not, and there is no effect on your own DNA. This is because enzymes break apart in DNA in your gut, and it is no longer functional. In fact, when a crop is processed down to its sugar, whether sugar beets, corn or oil, corn, soybean, canola, cotton, there is no protein left. No protein means no DNA. Is it true that foods with GMOs contain fewer nutrients? Genetic engineering has largely focused on reducing the need for insecticides and herbicides while boosting farmers' yields. That sort of modification does not affect the crop's nutrition. In fact, studies shows that genetically modified foods or GMOs are nutritionally identical to their conventional counterparts. There are few crops, for example high oleic soybeans, that have been designed to be nutritionally different and are labeled accordingly. So, don't worry, GMO food is totally safe for you. To conclude today's lesson, misconceptions can really impede learning for several reasons. First, students generally become unaware that the knowledge they have is wrong. Moreover, misconceptions can be very entrenched in students' thinking. In addition, students interpret new experience through these misinformed understandings, thereby interfering with being able to correctly grasp new information. Also, misconceptions tend to be very resistant to instruction because learning entails replacing or radically reorganizing students' knowledge. Hence, conceptual change has to occur for learning to happen. This will put teachers in the very challenging position of needing to bring about significant conceptual change in students' knowledge. Generally, ordinary forms of instruction such as lectures, labs, discovery learning, or simply reading text are not very successful at overcoming students' misconceptions. For all of these reasons, misconceptions can be very hard nuts for teachers to crack. However, several instructional strategies have proven to be effective in achieving conceptual change and helping students to leave their misconceptions behind and learn correct concepts and theories. That's all for today's presentation. For my part, thank you to my lecturer and classmates for lending your attention, for lending me your time. I'll pass the presentation to the next presenter.
Now we have reached the end of our presentation. I will conclude what we have learned today. Let's start from the theme. A theme gives general view of central topic of what students will learn throughout the chapters. Other than that, it represents a structure for integrating content areas. Learning around themes makes sense to the student. Interesting themes encourage a love of learning, make deeper connection, and the learning will become more meaningful when the student can relate what they have learned into the real world. After that, we have learning objective and learning outcomes. They are very crucial to the student and teacher in teaching and learning process. Other than motivating students to learn a new topic, it can help students to focus on what to be highlighted before starting to know what is important. It can increase student interest because it can reduce unnecessary stress on the student. Next, we have learned about key concepts which need to be explained briefly in the introduction of the chapter. This is because the key concept will be used until the final part of the topic. However, it can be improved by eliminating certain terms that are slightly related to the topic to avoid misconception. After that, common experiment in the textbook promote discovery and learning process. For your information, discovering new ideas is an integral part of learning science. It is something teachers cannot give to the student because the student itself needs to discover new ideas and concepts throughout their research. Finally, misconception, as you all know the meaning of it. It can interfere learning process in several reasons. This is because they use inaccurate understanding to interpret new experiences. Moreover, misconceptions tend to be very resistant in instruction. Hence, for concepts or theories in the curriculum where students have misconception, instead of adding to student knowledge, learning is a matter of radically reorganizing or replacing student knowledge. So, as an educators, we need to find a way to help students overcome with their misconception, because lecture, slides, video, lab session is not enough to improve their misconception. That is all from us. Thank you for watching. Assalamualaikum.